He took one look at my work and he said, "Stick with engineering." Once I got into it, I couldn't stop. Look, do I really want to spend the rest of my life doing what I'm doing at the moment? Then I thought, well, look, I should try my hand at architectural photography.
I want you to do something really original.
Well, I just really enjoyed looking at and recording buildings. So my photographs show it at its prime, and I do say I did a very good job on it. People eventually decide, look, there's more to architecture than just boxes. It's either apparent or it's not apparent. I could certainly tell you what's not a good picture.
Very good to see you.
Very good to see you.
And it's fantastic that we can have this conversation. It was actually a great pleasure to working with you the other week, to see you in action when we were photo shooting this exhibition at the Paul Rudolph Institute on the upper.
Yes, I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And I also enjoyed, I haven't photographed an exhibition where the space in which the exhibition was had assumed such a degree of importance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was really intense. And I want to show you that I have your book.
Oh, yes.
Yes, right here. Architectural Photography, Professional Techniques for Shooting Interior and Exterior Spaces. So it's perhaps the most important project in your career as a photographer was documenting the demolition of McKinley and White's Penn Station, which you did between 1963 and 1967. You call this immense building a flawed masterpiece. So I want you to talk about that, why that was your conclusion, and if you could talk about that experience.
Okay. Well, I mean, it was interesting because at the time that I did that photography, I was still not a full-time professional photographer. I was making the transition, but I was working as a structural engineer for a firm, Wayman C. Wing, whose offices were right opposite the station in the Pennsylvania Hotel.
Yeah, this is the hotel that was recently taken down.
Correct. That's exactly correct. And and I had a couple of reasons why. I mean, I did recognize at the time, even though I had not been in New York very long, I did recognize the significance of a building of the stature of Penn Station. But it was many years later until I really learned more about the history of the station and its objectives and so on. And that I have come to the conclusion, the more that I investigate now, that the station in a way became a victim of its own success. There's no question that Penn Station was a very necessary addition to New York because it provided the first direct link to Manhattan. Before that, you had to go, if you wanted to travel to the city, you had to transfer for the last section to a ferry to take you across the Hudson River, which was a tedious and a time-consuming undertaking. So that the Pennsylvania Railroad, who built the station, they were far and away the most successful railroads company in the nation. And they had already reduced the time that it took to get from Philadelphia, which was closer to their roots, to New York City, to 79 minutes. But then you had to transfer to a ferry, and so the last section of the journey was not at all what they had wanted. So they built the station, and even though the Pennsylvania Railroad owned the Long Island Railroad, they didn't do so because they were particularly interested in commuter traffic. That was very secondary. The reason that they purchased the Long Island Railroad was because the railroad had access to some vital locations that were really vital to Eastern Seaboard networks. And for that reason, they wanted access to these. So they could have, I think, if they had stopped to think a little bit about it, they should certainly have realized that the station would become a boon to commuters, because it would shave a huge amount of time off the time that it took to get, say, from Long Island or New Jersey into the city. So they could have predicted that when traffic started, it would be predominantly with commuters. And it quickly became apparent that about 2/3 of the users of the station would not indeed be the long-distance travelers that the station was really built to glorify, and which the whole really superstructure of Penn Station was focused on, but on commuters. So, in a way, the station was a failure from the very outset, because its main objective wasn't what they had anticipated. And so overcrowding started to occur really at a pretty early stage, even before there were subway connections. And because the subway networks were at a very early stage in their development.
So it was immense, but not immense enough, right?
Well, it wasn't. The thing was, of course, the Pennsylvania Railroad, as soon as once it had been decided that the service into Penn Station would be, first of all, I mean, they had to decide whether it was going to be a bridge or a tunnel that got the railroad into Manhattan. And it was only after a lot of research and so on. And also after the after the building of the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, that it showed that you could have an underground railroad system that was based on electrification of the main lines, and that once that was possible, it meant that you could have tunnels under the river, which had been not feasible before because of the terrific pollution that steam trains caused. And once that occurred, it meant, almost by definition, that most of the guts of Penn Station would be underground, and that they could indeed have built Penn Station underground in the first place. But the objective of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was then the most profitable company in the nation, they wanted visibility. They wanted to glorify rail travel. So building something that was totally below ground was just not on the cards at all, either for the architects or for anybody else. So that meant, in a way, that you were building a station with very much with the impression that the station would create on the city and on train users. Well, as you probably know, commuters don't normally care very much about the surround and how they get to where they are. They're interested in getting from point A to point B as efficiently and quickly as possible. And in order to do that, they didn't actually have to use the above ground at parts of the station. They were strictly underground and needed to get from point A to point B, being their arrival point in wherever in the station they arrived, to a subway, or vice versa. And that was not how the station was originally conceived. It wasn't designed. It was designed for the long distance traveler, and very much in a linear way, with the ideal passenger arriving at the 33rd Street entrance on 7th Avenue and then proceeding down the arcade into the waiting hall, and then purging their tickets, making baggage arrangements, and then proceeding to the concourse. And it was always the concourse that was the most glorious part of Penn Station. That was the most admired part of the station. And when you think about it and you see photographs of the station today, it's almost invariably the concourse which is depicted. You rarely see pictures of the outside. Why? Because the station was so damn big that you couldn't get back far enough to capture the whole station. You could only capture it in detail. And Charles McKim, the architect, really was not an admirer of Manhattan architecture. He thought it was much too vertical. So he designed the most horizontal building that he possibly could have. And when you think about it, he received the commission to design the station when he was working on redoing the evolution of Washington, D.C. And I think secretly, he thought he was designing the station for Washington, D.C. And if you think about it, the layout of the station and its design was much better suited to Washington, D.C. than it ever was to Manhattan. I mean, if nothing else was proof of that, the fact that, in 1931, what happens? The Empire State Building gets completed only a block east of Penn Station. So the most vertical building in the world with contrasting with the most horizontal one. And it just didn't fit. It just didn't fit. The building really, in some respects, was out of place from the very beginning.
Yeah, in a way, you would discover vertical dimension of the station already when you were inside of it, right? Not outside.
Yeah. And the thing, the most dramatic parts of the design of the station, as far as I'm concerned, was the roof of the concourse. And if you were at street level, you couldn't see that. You, in fact, were not even aware that the concourse was there. Only the upper portions of the waiting hall were visible from street level. And as soon as buildings grew up around the station, you had these endlessly long east and west facades over 700 feet with not a tree or a blade of grass or anything like that to soften it. And nothing very inviting about the building. It was very forbidding. The building was not appealing.
Yeah, when I look at the photographs now, obviously I never had the chance to see the building in person. I would agree with you that's the biggest flaw of the original design, because the building occupies the entire block. So it was built almost like Mark mentioned. It just maximum.
And it never, and for some reason or other, they never announced on the outside of the building. They never put the name Pennsylvania Station on the outside of the building. There was nothing to identify it unless you knew that that's what it was. And of course, most people did. But and of course, because of the style of the building, most people assumed that it was built by and owned by the government. But in fact, it wasn't. It was private enterprise. And surprisingly, completely paid for by corporate money. Not subsidized one bit, which is astounding when you think about it.
Yeah, but we will talk about the Penn Station project and you documenting its demolition a little later. I want to go back to the very beginning. So you grew up in Dublin. You went to the university at Trinity College in Dublin to study engineering, even though you, I guess, always wanted to study architecture because your father was an architect. And
Yes.
you knew a lot about architecture. If you could touch on that and how you started.
All right. So I mean, I did grow up in Dublin, but in fact, I was born in London. And so the early part of my life, from 1931 when I was born until 1940 when we left, my father had been in private. He founded his architectural practice in London, and then had to close his office in 1939 at the outbreak of World War II. And by that time, I had seen two very modern houses. One of them was the house that Serge Chimaev designed for himself outside London. And the other one was a house that my father designed and was completed in 1937, called St. Anne's Hill, which was designed for the landscape architect Christopher Tannard and his close friend, who paid for it. Now, that was a house that was inspired partly by Le Corbusier. It was built of poured concrete, and it had walls that exposed concrete walls with the visible vertical shuttering on the outside. So and it's a round in shape. So it was and all the landscaping of that house was done by Tannard. And originally, I think Tannard had hoped to live with his friend in this house. Now, they had a falling out, so it's not clear to me if they ever did, in fact, live in that house. But I remember visiting that house, and of course, one of the things that really amazed me about it is it had a very shallow, largely decorative, not a swimming pool, but a decorative pool. And there were penguins in that pool.
Wow.
A private house with penguins. Now, that was something. Now, I had grown up in Park Crescent at the top of Portland Place. So I was not a great distance from the London Zoo.
So you
one of the things I remember about the London Zoo was, of course, the marvelous penguin house. I thought that was one of the coolest buildings in the world at the time. So I was influenced by a couple of pieces of very modern architecture at an early age.
And the reason you studied engineering, because architecture department was not a part of the college where you were in Dublin.
Exactly. My education in Ireland had all been directed towards Trinity College because of, it's far and away the best known university at the time. And it so happened that in that era, the architecture school at University College Dublin, which was the Catholic university and much bigger actually than Trinity. My father didn't think that it was a terribly good school, and he felt that if I was going to study architecture, it should be at a good school. But this was the late 50s, so there were still people coming out of the service in Britain. So getting into an architectural school was very, very tough. And since my schooling had all been directed towards Trinity, I just sort of naturally ended up there. And it wasn't until after my first year that I thought, well, maybe I have to do something more serious than liberal arts. I have to really make a living. And at the time, Ove Arup was already a good friend. And Ove Arup, of course, was the great Danish structural engineer. His first overseas office after London was in Dublin. And I went to work in his Dublin office after I graduated. So I worked for a year in that office. But and Ove Arup, at one point, knowing that of my interest in architecture and also later in photography, he offered me the job of being photographer to Ove Arup and Partners.
Wow.
And
when I was done,
at the time, I thought, oh gosh, this is a marvelous opportunity, but I don't know enough about photography at the moment, nor do I know enough about, that I didn't feel that I was sufficiently qualified for the job. So I turned that down, but my life could have been very different. I could have ended up being the photographer for Ove Arup, now worldwide, and my photography would have taken a very different career, a very different path.
So when was that offer come to you?
Yes, sometime in the 50s.
In the 50s. Okay.
Yeah. I had already graduated at that point as a structural engineer.
And that probably influenced your decision to even go into studying photography, right?
Well, what influenced my going into photography first was, I had not had, my first camera really didn't occur. It didn't happen until my graduation from Trinity. And my best friend, Colin Bowden at Trinity College and fellow engineer, he was given a graduation present of a new camera. And I bought his old camera. And it was a very simple rangefinder, 35 millimeter German camera, and with removable lenses. But it was one of the most difficult pieces of equipment to handle, because every time you changed lenses, you had to change viewfinders, because it was, and it was hard work. But I had, from an early stage, I had decided that I really wanted to come to America after graduation.
And you were in America, I guess, as a child or as a teenager, because your uncle lived in America and your mother was an American, right?
Right. I came to America when I was 2.5 and when I was 5.5.
Oh, wow.
Twice. And we spent extended periods in Dallas, Texas, where my grandfather and I developed a very close relationship. And that relationship was really, I think, what cemented my desire to come and live in America.
And
By an early age. I never seriously considered going anyplace else, which was surprising, considering of the 32 engineers that graduated in 1955 from Trinity College, Dublin, only 2 stayed in Ireland. And all the rest went overseas, many to Canada. I think I was the only one that came to the United States. Some went to England, some went to Northern Ireland, 1 or 2, I think, went to Africa. But I was the only one that came to the United States. It was not easy to get a visa back then, and it was a sort of tedious process. And Canada was offering all sorts of incentives to engineers to come work in Canada. They would, free passage and all guarantees of jobs and all sorts of things. But the United States was much more difficult to get to. But then I had some connections, and I also had the desire, and I wasn't in a hurry. But I was also worried about the fact that at age 25, if I came to America at age 25, I could still be drafted, because the cutoff was age 26. And so I predicated all my arrangements so that I would be 26 when I came, but I miscalculated, and I ended up coming a couple of months too soon, and I almost got drafted. I mean, I was given an A1 health rating, and I was told to stand by to be drafted at any minute, but it never happened.
And so that was already 1956 when you came to the US. So I guess you were almost 26, around that age.
Yep.
And you started working for a structural engineer. As you mentioned, the office was at the Pennsylvania Hotel, right?
Well, that was my second job.
Oh, second job.
Yeah. I had originally planned. I came to New York, and I was originally put up by my mother's first cousin and her husband, who were from the South, and very lovely people. And I could stay there as long as I wanted. They lived in Bronxville. So my first weekend in America was not at all what I had expected. It was I was in a green suburb where I'd expected not to see any trees in New York, and things like that. And then it was the eve of the Labor Day weekend in 1956 when I arrived, and that weekend was spent in Northport, Long Island, at a very wealthy resort, friends of my mother's cousins. So I had a very lavish Labor Day weekend, and that was my introduction to America.
So you were this was a peek into your country.
Yeah. But I had originally intended to go on to Dallas, Texas, where my grandfather was no longer alive because he died in 1942 during the war. But my uncle and aunt and cousins all lived in Dallas, and I was going to go and try my luck in Dallas. But I thought, well, before I do that, maybe I should just see what's available in New York. I had no ideas. And so I pursued that for a couple of weeks, and I went to places, big companies like Bechtel, which were big contractors, because I wanted what I felt that I needed most was, and of course I was only a very green engineer. I'd only had a year's experience in Dublin, and most of that was in the office. Not very much of it was on site. So. And I thought, well, I can get construction experience with a big company like Bechtel, but it seemed so impersonal to me, and it didn't appeal. And after going for several interviews, I eventually decided, okay, I'm going to go to Dallas. And practically on the eve of my departure, I got a call from a company that I had made an appointment with and I had failed to keep. And they said, look, we know that we hear that you're headed for Dallas, but why don't you come and talk to us first anyway? And as it turned out, it was just what I'd been looking for. It was a large consulting firm which would give me both design and field experience. And it was right in the heart of Manhattan. Their offices were in the Architects Building, right opposite Grand Central, that I had passed through on my first day in America. And it turned out to be the ideal job. And I worked for them for nearly about 5.5 years, into the early 60s. And it was at that time that I decided, look, do I really want to spend the rest of my life doing what I'm doing at the moment? And while I'd had some interesting jobs and stuff like that, I didn't really feel 100% comfortable doing that. And that in the meantime, because equipment had been so much less expensive, and I'd become increasingly involved photographer, and a lot of the things that I'd been photographing were in fact building, that I thought, well, look, I should try my hand at architectural photography.
In recent years, you had two important exhibitions on your work. One was called An Eye on Architecture exhibition, which was held at the Center for Architecture in 2011 when you turned 80.
Yeah.
And then Penn Station, a flawed masterpiece at the Century Association in 2024, just last year. Then you published two books. The one I showed, Architectural Photography and Photographing Buildings Inside Out. So if you could talk more a little bit about your decision on becoming a photographer and what really sparked initially interest in becoming a photographer.
Well, I just really enjoyed looking at and recording buildings. And I just and unlike architecture, where you can be involved in a single architectural project for years, and I'm not sure that I would have had the patience to do that. I think I could have been a pretty decent architect, but I'm not sure I would have been great. But somehow or other, as photography just seemed to be a good fit. But the problem was, how do I achieve this objective? Because there were virtually no schools of architectural photography. There were schools of photography, but architectural photography is so unique and its demands are so specific that you really do have to have courses that are very much, and that the most obvious way to become an architectural photographer was to become apprenticed to an existing architectural photographer. And I sought out one photographer whom I didn't know personally. Anyway, he took one look at my work and he said, "Stick with engineering." He was not very encouraging at all. But I fortunately I persevered and but then the great break that I had was when I got a call from one of the associates of the firm that I had originally been working for and whom I knew. And he said, "Norman, I hear that you are interested in getting into the field of architectural photography. I wonder if in the meantime that you're interested in eating." And this, I didn't have capital. I mean, I had enough money to exist for a while, but I knew perfectly well that I couldn't, you can't suddenly enter a profession and expect to make a living at it. Whereas with my qualifications, I certainly could make a reasonable living and live comfortably as an engineer. So anyway, I was able to make an arrangement with Wayman C. Wing, who took his whole division from the previous company, Seeley Stevenson Value and Connect. And he set up his company, and I agreed to work for him 4 days a week. And I figured that on the salary that I could make ends meet without relying on anything from photography. And that arrangement is really what permitted me to become a photographer. Without that arrangement, I don't know what I would have done. It would have been
That firm was the one which was
in the Pennsylvania hotel.
Inside the Pennsylvania hotel. Yeah.
And
so documenting the destruction, the demolition of Pennsylvania Station became your first project, right?
Well, at the time, a photographer friend of mine whom I much admired, Hans Nemeth, a German photographer, who did not architectural photography, but he photographed mainly artists, particularly Jackson Pollock. He told me that what I should do is I should take a course with Alexei Brodovitch. Now, at the time, Alexei Brodovitch was he had been the art director for Harper's Bazaar, and he gave regular workshops mainly for photographers, although he was not a photographer, he was a graphic designer. And it was Brodovitch who discovered Richard Avedon while he was at Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, and offered him his first assignment. And Brodovitch was he spoke with a very thick Russian accent, and he was quite severe, and he would say, "I want you to do something really original." He rolled his eyes and stuff like that. "I don't want just typical stuff. I want something decent and that will catch your name." And you were persuaded to produce work that you could then present to the class, and then you could then open it for discussion. And I thought, oh, well, I'm going to select Penn Station.
How long was that course?
It was only a year.
Oh,
And of course, the demolition went on for much longer. And of course, but I'd become so involved in it by that stage that even though I had no client, and even though I was completely unofficial, and in fact, indeed, I was trespassing every time I went into the station, that because the station was so big, and because it was impossible to have the sort of security which would have prevented my from circulating around there, that because one of the conditions of the demolition of the station was that it remained a completely functioning station without interruption. I worked on the station for several months, and then I put together a show and presented that to the class.
okay.
And then that was then thrown open for discussion.
And what did he say?
Oh, he was he thought it was a very good series.
And no one else did it, right? So it was...
No, there was nobody else doing it. No. I however, was working with a close friend who shared my interest in the station. And that was the photographer, Aaron Rose. Now, Aaron Rose was not an architectural photographer. And he's a whole story in himself, because he came from a very unlikely background, in that he was brought up as a ward of the city of New York. He was his mother had to give him up for adoption. She couldn't support it. And somehow or other, he had then apprenticed himself to a photographer to learn the trade. And he'd become an astonishingly talented photographer.
You met him because he was also photographing the demo?
No. I met him privately, and we just became very good friends. So that when they started demolition on the station, I'd met him before they started demolition.
Okay.
And we became good friends. And then and then he lived in a Stanford White building, and he very much admired Stanford White. And we both at that time thought that Stanford White was the designer of the station. Turned out it was his company, not Stanford White. It was Charles McKim, but I didn't know that then. And so I know an awful lot more about the station now than I did back then.
And you said that you took this course for about a year, but you kept photographing the station for...
Oh, right. Well, once I got into it, I couldn't stop. In order to try and promote myself, I realized that the key to getting into the architectural field was publication. You had to get your photographs published. And so I went to all the architectural magazines. And there were then 5 architectural magazines in New York. Not just Architectural Record, there was Progressive Architecture, there was Architectural Forum, there was Architecture, there was Interiors, and so on. And I made myself known to all the editors and picture editors and so on in these magazines. And they were, initially they sort of brushed me off as much as they could, but I was persistent, and I kept showing them material. And then gradually they began to see that I had a good eye, and that I was producing publishable work. So little by little, I started to gain a foothold in the publishing field.
I wonder, since you were photographing this project, this demolition, for a long time, anything that surprised you that you can recall the most?
Well, first of all, there was something almost inevitable about the demise of the station. And I think that you have to realize that by the time the station was demolished, it had become very seedy, and it had become really rather neglected. The fortunes of the railroad company, of course, had changed drastically. It went from being the preferred method of interstate travel to being a very distant third. And the government policy promoted the interstate road system and air travel. So it really was government policy that led to the demise of Penn Station. And they air travel and road travel were heavily subsidized one way or another. And the reverse was true for railroad travel. Nobody valued railroad travel. And there were not only that, but when it came to charging fares, the rates that the railroad company could charge had to be kept affordable by government regulation, without any thought to how can these railroads make a living. The result was that they really couldn't. They just could not survive under those circumstances. And so it was government policy really that caused the demise of the station.
Once the station was demolished and this project was finished for you, what was the next ambition? What did you do next?
Well, the thing was, even while I was still photographing it, there were various editors, particularly at Architectural Forum, who were, who admired the station and so on. But do you think I could get any of that work published? Nobody seemed to be interested. Nobody gave a damn. It's just like, I figure, okay, this is just another building. It's gone now. That's too bad. But of course, it wasn't gone. All the traffic was there. It was just now unseen, or a lot of it was unseen.
I want to ask you about some other projects. I know you said that Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans was your...
Right. I was lucky on that. I had been introduced at one point to Charles Moore, who was the Dean of Architecture at Yale. And he was one of these very amenable professors. When the Piazza d'Italia was finished, and the Piazza was an interesting project because it's really, in a way, it's a sort of a folly. It was an urban renewal area in a part of the downtown New Orleans section. And they decided that they wanted that the project would be much better with some focal point in the middle of it. So they designated this area to be the piazza. But they decided to build it before they did the urban renewal, and that they would use the piazza as a come-on to draw attention to it. That was a brilliant idea. And so as soon as it was finished, I was sent down there to photograph it. And it was a very elaborate project. I'm looking at a photograph I have here in my office. And it incorporated not only incredible waterworks that all sprayed down from one level to another, and two heads incorporated into the walls of the piazza, which spouted water, which were in fact faces of Charles Moore. And he had a great sense of humor. But it also had incredible neon lights, which at night were every color under the rainbow, and unbelievable. And I went down there, and everything was just perfect. So, and so I did photographs of that, where I managed, even though it was in a downtown area, I managed to by doing it fairly close in, I managed to conceal the fact that it was surrounded by other buildings. So only in one or two cases do you see these others, even though it was in a built-up area. And because it was in such great shape, And because it was subsequently neglected, it became very difficult to rephotograph it. So my photographs show it at its prime, and I do say I did a very good job on it. As you know, the postmodern architecture movement was a real revolution in architecture. And it came about because so many people tried to emulate the Mies approach to architecture, which was no embellishment and everything to be rectangular and so on and so forth. And when you try and do that without the quality that Mies had, it's very difficult. So that our cities became filled with rectangular blocks, which had none of the finesse that the Seagram building had. And you can still look at the Seagram building and see it's still a marvelous looking building. And there's not another modern building that you can compare with it that's better. I mean, it's the best. But people eventually decide, look, there's more to architecture than just boxes. We've had all different styles and so on like that. So the postmodern movement was a revolution against the simplicity of modernism as it was depicted by Mies. And so and this was at exactly the time that the Piazza came along for Charles Moore, and Charles Moore, of course, being in the education field, pulled out all the stops, and he decided that he would produce the ultimate piece of non-modern architecture. And so any time now that somebody wants to write about postmodernism and they want to illustrate it with one illustration, they go to the Piazza d'Italia, because it personifies everything about postmodernism in a way that few other projects do. I mean, here you have a complex which takes all the classical forms of architecture, but uses concrete, steel, stainless steel, and so on, in ways that nobody would have dreamt of using them, and then putting them all in one project. And it was it was a marvelous, tongue-in-cheek piece of work.
Did you have a chance to discuss this project with Charles Moore?
He was not there for the photography, but he certainly approved of what I did, and I mean, it got him a lot of publicity as well as myself.
What about other projects? You also worked with such architects as Hugh Stubbins. You photographed his City Corp Center in Manhattan. You also worked with Michael Grace, Peter Eisenman, Charles Guatme, Myron.
Right.
What would you?
Well, I will say of those, I can't remember what magazine it was, but there was one magazine early on that gave me the assignment to photograph Charles Guathme's house that he did with his first partner, which was Guathme and Henderson was their firm name, and they had taken a house and they'd modernized it, and he did interiors like that, and I managed to get some photographs of Charlie. That project put him on the map, but I also became very friendly with him, so that when he and Henderson parted the company and he started Guathme Siegel, he came to me for photography. And I had a long relationship with Charlie, and he understood probably as much as any of my clients ever did the importance of photography, and because how your buildings are depicted and seen by people who don't necessarily have the experience of going and actually visiting them, that he understood how important photography was, and he was always very involved. And he would come on the shoots with me, and we would discuss angles and so on. So he was a great client. He was terrific work.
Did you photograph the house that he did for his parents?
Yes, I did. I didn't do the original photographs, but he had me photograph them because I went to visit. In fact, I stayed in that house as a guest on one occasion when we were photographing out in other houses in the Hamptons, and so I got some very nice photographs of that. And it's, as a piece of modern house architecture, that's still as good a piece of architecture as there is out there. I mean, it's just so simple and such a strong piece of work. I've looked at it many times since, and it really was a masterpiece.
What about Peter Eisenman? He's the architect. I don't.
he was another piece of work because he was an architect who he sort of tolerated his clients. His clients were sort of a means to an end. They were just what gave him the sort of permission to sort of do what he possibly could. And it's really, I photographed not many of his houses, but he didn't do that many, but I did photograph a couple of them. And there was the first one that I photographed was up in Vermont. And Progressive Architecture called me and they said, Peter Eisenman has got this house in Vermont and we want you to go photograph it. And, but he says, Peter and the owners of the house are not on very good terms.
Wow.
So you will only be able to photograph the outside. And it was the middle of winter in Vermont. So I flew up to Vermont and there was a couple of feet of snow on the ground, bloody cold. And with some difficulty, I found out where the house was. And so then I started to scout it. And it was in a very exposed site on a hill. So you couldn't sort of go up to the house and then walk around and stuff because of the deep snow. And then you would leave tracks everywhere and then it would ruin your photograph. So I had to be very careful. I had to sort of scout around the very perimeter of the far distance first, and then select these things, and then gradually approach the house, knowing that I couldn't sort of retrace my tracks. And I'd been told that this was a weekend house primarily. I think it wasn't a full-time residence, and that there was nobody in the house. But then I realized that there was a wisp of smoke coming out of one of the chimneys of the house. And I thought, God, what am I going to do? So I eventually, I did most of my photography, and then I went up to the house and I decided, I would have to, go and tell them what I was doing. And I knocked on the door, and this young lad came to the door, and he was a house sitter, or he was either the son or a house sitter like that. And so he came in and he let me look through the house. So I never did meet the owners of the house, but I managed to get these things, and then it appeared in Progressive Architecture.
So you photographed inside, right, as well?
I think I did manage to do one or two interior pictures, yes.
So was this house too, folk house in?
Yeah, I think that was house two. But the creme de la creme was house 6, and house 6 was owned by a photographer. And Peter Eisenman pulled out all the stops, And this was a really bizarre house in Connecticut. And
this is where the bed is split into two, right? Bed.
the bedroom, it's got a sort of a piece in the floor that's transparent. Right. And the thing was that Peter spent so much on the house that the poor photographer who paid for it didn't have any money left over for furniture. So he just had the most simple furniture that you could dream of. And House and Garden decided that House 6 had to be recorded. But they couldn't photograph it with the furniture that was in it. So they approached the owner and said, look, what we would like to do is we would like to come and refurnish your house for photography.
Wow.
If you give us permission. So he said, sure. Yeah, you can do that. And so they approached Massimo Vignelli. And Massimo Vignelli selected all the furniture. And they got a great big van. And they got all this furniture down to the house. They took all the furniture out, put it on the lawn someplace where it couldn't be seen, and then furnished the house completely. And I worked with the great editor Elizabeth Sverbaev, who was then working for House and Garden, and we did a real number on that. And but of course, the interiors are complete fiction because it was furnished by Massimo Vignelli, and that's not the way the house was.
So after the photo shoot, all the furniture was put on
maybe they gave one or two items to the owner of the.
You had to go back to reality.
And this is the house where there is a stair. It's green on one side, red on underneath, right?
Well, yeah, this is a house where the underside of the stair is stepped the same way as the top part is. And it's a stair, it doesn't go anywhere. It's
not going anywhere. So where is it going?
It's just and so I took what is possibly my most abstract photograph of an interior. And proof of that is that when my book on architectural photography came out, I used that photograph, and I didn't realize for a couple of weeks that it was upside down.
The photograph was upside down.
Not on purpose, right?
Not on purpose. But you mentioned I did two books. I did two books that are really very different. I did one of them, which was photographing buildings inside and out. And that book was very, very successful. And I felt that I had to do that book because I had the experience of, almost, sort of training myself as an architect and photographer by experiment and one thing or another. And giving guidance to, how to do it if you wanted to follow my footsteps. And that book sold 47,000 copies. And it was, at one point, it was the second biggest selling imprint of photo. I mean, a very successful book.
Could you talk about your collaboration with Myron Goldfinger? Because I know that you actually ended up commissioning him to design your own house.
Right.
That's an interesting relationship.
Right. I knew. My first assignment was to photograph Myron's apartment in Kips Bay in the very early days. This is before his family was born. And they had some pretty quirky furniture, which much of which they still have, or June has. And so it got quite a lot of, I can't remember whether it was New York Magazine or who it was that gave me the assignment. It was not an architectural magazine. Anyhow, we became good friends because we, lived in Kips Bay and stuff like that. So, and then I forget what year it was, but that, shortly after that, Myron designed the house in Walkerburg for himself and June. Well, this was a way out house in every possible way. And I photographed that, and I photographed it for the New York Times, and it was widely published. But it was probably one of the least practical houses I have ever photographed. And so,
what do you mean? Less practical than the houses by Peter Eisenman?
well, maybe not that. No, maybe not. No, not less than that. But when you think about it, Myron was something of a purist. I mean, he had very definite ideas of design, and they were always foremost in his mind when he designed something. So if that was inconvenient from a practical standpoint, so be it. That's the way it was. He wasn't gonna compromise. First of all, it's deep in the woods. You go up a narrow path. You park as close as you can to it, somewhat the same as our own house, and then you have to walk up a random stone path to get to the front door, which is a sliding front door, and you go into a very narrow space because behind you are a whole line of closets. Off to your right, there's an opening, and you can see part of a spiral stair that leads up, but you can't get into it from there. You have to go to your left, to your right, and to your right again, and walk around this whole center section of closets to get to the base of the stair. That's the number one. I mean, to put it mildly, and the spiral stair is the only way that you can get to the second floor. And I don't know if you know anything about spiral stairs, but they're not the easiest thing to negotiate. They're narrow and it's somewhat dangerous.
They are nice to look at.
Nice to look at, but rarely. And I don't even think. I'm sure they didn't meet code, so he must have put in temporary stairs or something in order to make that meet code. All the living occurred at the second floor, except the bedrooms, which were above. So when you went up to the next level, you went through a pantry, and then the pantry led you into a square kitchen with no windows. And then from there, two openings led to a dining area, which then terminated in another balcony. Well, it terminated in a balcony that went on to another element and then went up the other side. So to get to the other part of the house that supported this balcony, you had to go outside. Well, I mean, they had a very nice built-in dining room table and stuff like that, and then that was very convenient to the kitchen. And then the pantry, as I say, was around there. Well, as I say, if you're in the kitchen, the only way you could see out sort of through those two openings that went to the dining area. Well, over time, the whole idea of having a part of the house that you could only access by going outside in the wintertime and stuff really didn't make any sense. But the house, let's face it, it was a house that was designed primarily as a summer residence. Myron wasn't thinking about the seasons. And when you got over to the other side, Myron had his studio there, and then you went downstairs to a guest room. And that whole thing was a bridge. So the house had sort of two separate elements with this bridge connecting. Well, the site was extremely precipitous. You couldn't walk around the house. It was much too rugged and that. So the only places you could get into the house was through the front door. But the other thing was that all the rooms in the house, as you went up, all had balconies that overlooked the space down below with a sloping wall, and it sort of pinwheeled around like this. So none of the spaces had any audio privacy at all. Well, when it came time to select an architect, I had all these things in mind. We can't possibly have a house like that. Too many things like that wouldn't work. But then the more I thought about it, I said, if we tell Meyer what elements of his architecture we like, and there certainly were some we did, and what that we didn't like and would not put up with, was that every bedroom had to be self-contained and was not to be a space that overlooked some other space without any audio privacy. And we figured, okay, we'll give him this brief, and if it works, fine. So he came up with, I think, one of his best designs, a fairly simple but very complicated at one level house. I mean, it's simple and it's not very big, but it did everything that we asked it for. And we loved it.
So he was open to listening to your suggestions.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, look,
So
if any good architect, if you've given a brief and said, look, we like this, but we're not prepared to take that, and that. So even if that might be his signature style, he couldn't incorporate build spaces. I mean, in our own house, we did have a bridge over our living room, which was a separate viewing area for TV, and that did overlook the spaces on the upper part of the living room. So I suppose in that respect, and there were times when, somebody would want to watch, the kids might want to watch a TV show or something like that when we'd have guests downstairs. We'd have to tell them no.
What about your collaboration with Philip Johnson? How did you meet him?
I met him because I was given an assignment to photograph for his 75th birthday. My assignment was from architectural digest, and they could photograph anything but the glass house. So that meant they could do the underground gallery, they could do the guest house, they could do the sculpture gallery, they could do his little office in the woods, and I can't remember if they at that time if they'd had the I don't know if the guest entrance had been done at that time or not, but that was more than enough. And plus the Kirsten Tower, which was a piece of tower, made of cloth, and the pavilion on the lake, which is of course Ollie, which looks like a Greek temple until you realize the thing is only 4 feet high, and that only when you see somebody beside it do you realize that it's tiny, because there's nothing to give it scale. And so I became very friendly with Philip as a result of that, because he loved the photographs that I took, and he subsequently gave me literally carte blanche to come back anytime and take photographs at my leisure. So I over the years, I not only took the glass house itself, but I took many photographs of the whole state. And he once told me he thought that my photographs were the best that had been taken of the glass house estate. I mean, he was very generous, I will say. I asked Philip Johnson at one point to contribute to my collection of miniatures, and I gave him a copy of one of my father's books, or a book on my father by my late brother-in-law, and he liked that a lot. And so he instead of doing a miniature, he tore off a sheet of tracing paper and then he wrote on it, Love the book. Thanks very much. Sorry I can't contribute to your miniatures, but I can't draw. Love and kisses, Frank Johnson.
You still have that, right?
Oh, I do. Of course I have it. Yeah, I have that whole thing framed. Yeah.
It's amazing. He was the first person who was given the Pritzker Prize, and he couldn't draw.
Right. That's so he claimed. We haven't even broached on the subject of my archive. In 2013, the Library of Congress bought my archive. They suggested the price, which ended up being $250,000. Well, that was pretty damn good, particularly since I'd known that architectural photographers in particular, that what to do with their archives is a big problem. Some of it is valuable, but yet valuable to whom? And a lot of businesses won't take on archives unless they've been given a large sum of money in order to maintain them. And I managed to work out a deal in 2013 that I still retained the right to make black and white or color prints for as long as I lived. Eventually, this stuff would go to them. So I've continued to print up, and I'm still printing away to this day. And
yeah, printing and publishing, right?
But I was so busy for much of my career that, unlike some photographers, I never did very much. I never sold many of my photographs just for, quotes, art. And that has made it more difficult for me in my semi-retirement to translate that into anything that I can sort of justify, doing as much work as I'm doing.
This archive that they acquired, how big is it? How many photographs? These are thousands and thousands of photographs?
Yes.
Your work? All your projects?
All the projects. Yeah, everything.
How would you describe what a good picture is?
It's either apparent or it's not apparent. I could certainly tell you what's not a good picture, but telling you what is, I mean, there are just too many different ways of evaluating something. And it's interesting because we were talking earlier about the Piazza d'Italia, because one of the key, and that incidentally is the most published project I ever photographed. Yes. It's been published all over the world. Anytime anybody wants to write about postmodernism, I get a request.
You're talking about one particular picture, or it's a series of photographs?
Well, it's primarily the one picture that has it's this one.
Oh, you have it right there?
I have that one.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yes, it's quite famous, very iconic.
Yeah. So Now, it turns out that I had a very big black and white enlargement of that thing. And that particular photograph is two completely different things in color and in black and white. And I really prefer it in black and white.
Oh, interesting.
And I have recently, I had a big enlargement made where I took the black and white print, and then I reversed it on the right, and then I put them upside down below. And it became an abstraction, which is so abstract, it's unbelievable that it's hardly recognizable that it's the same photograph. And yet, it is. And that's one of the things I suppose that I have enjoyed doing in my semi-retirement.
I wonder if finally you can say a few words about whether you follow contemporary architectural photography right now, and if you have any, if you know any photographers that you follow, and what could you say about this moment? Are you seeing any progression or any kind of, if you could offer me maybe a critical view of where architectural photography is right now?
I only know a handful of the contemporary architectural photographers. I still subscribe to Architectural Record. As I look through the magazine now, most of the names are unfamiliar to me, so I just don't know who they are. And of the contemporary photographers, most have been around for quite a while. People like Peter Aaron, Jeff Goldberg, both originally of Esto. That's Ezra Stoller and Associates, his group. And Chuck Smith out of Fort Worth, Texas. He's a very good Texas photographer, and a handful of others whom I've sort of a little bit lost track of. When it comes to manipulation of photographs, Peter Aaron is the one who comes to mind most frequently. And he's for example, when he photographs, say, the building on the campus of a university or educational facility, what he will do is he will set his camera up, and he has an assistant, and he has or assistants. He will light different parts of the subject for one part of the of his procedure, and then he will go back into the lab, or he will go back to his consultant, will go back to the lab, and they will piece together all the different elements which go to make up the photograph. But it will not have been taken at one time. It may have been taken, and it may be a dozen images, as many as that, or fewer, depending on the. So what he's able to do then, he's able to populate his photographs. Sometimes, he could, if he chose to, he could have one or two people, but in many different positions and in many different locations in the same photograph. He doesn't do that, but he could. And he could then combine them all together and populate the photograph in ways that are in fact fiction. But of course, they produce very, very, very controlled photographs. But they're very different than the way most photographers work. Not very many photographers. He's got a very elaborate system, so that he's got different color codes, so that when he takes a particular exposure, it's color coded as to whether it's just the bright illuminated area of the picture that is then combined in a computer subsequently to produce the whole. I mean, it's a fascinating way of going, but boy, is it time consuming, and it requires. And Peter doesn't do all his own computer work. I do all my own computer work. I do my own printing.
So you're saying that a lot of it is done through post-production, right?
Oh, tremendous amount. Right.
Are you friends with him?
Yes, and he has been to. He went to Syria, and he did a lot of photography there of areas that have since been destroyed. Classical.
Oh, you're talking about ancient architecture, like
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's terrible. Well, it's pretty astounding to think that there are really the number of things in our archives that don't exist anymore. You know, I have always tried in New York to, when I get an opportunity to photograph a building that, for example, first becomes visible because some adjacent building has been torn down. I was trying to go and do that. So I've got many photographs now that can no longer be duplicated. And so historically, they probably have some considerable significance. The one thing that we have not talked about at all is that I did partly get involved because of my willingness to share some of my expertise. I did get involved in quite a lot of lecturing and teaching. And so I have done workshops for, I initially did some for ICP. I gave courses in architectural photography at ICP when they were up on Fifth Avenue. And that's a long time ago. And then through, and for years at the main photographic workshops.
And do you teach
now?
Do you teach now?
Only if somebody invites me to. I mean, I have twice been invited in the last couple of years down to Princeton, and I've given lectures on Penn Station, but those were just one-offs.
Okay. Well,
invite me.
Yes. Norman, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing experience. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and I enjoyed it.